Welcome. Thank you all for being here. My name is Tom Perez, and I'm the director of the Coelho Center for Disability Law, Policy, and Innovation. And apparently my remarks are not up here. Lindsay, my remarks? You handed them to me? Just a second. Okay, it is my honor to open this event, and now that I officially have my remarks, it's also my honor to introduce Timothy Law Snyder. He's president of Loyola Marymount University. He has been a dedicated professor and administrator at Jesuit universities for more than 30 years. He earned his MA and his Ph.D. in applied and computational mathematics from Princeton University. He also has an MS in mathematics and a BA in psychology and a BS in mathematics from the University of Toledo. Since arriving at LMU in 2015, President Snyder has challenged the university to reimagine its global, creative, and interdisciplinary footprints. Under his leadership, LMU has strengthened diversity and inclusion programs, achieved record-setting enrollments, improved significantly in national rankings, and opened a third campus in the heart of Silicon Beach. And that's where we're at today. Thank you. Keep those applause going. Please join me in welcoming the 16th president of LMU, President and Professor Timothy Law Snyder.
Thank you, Catherine, for your bold leadership of the Coelho Center. You and your brilliant team are shaping our future and building a better tomorrow, and you're doing that today. So you're traveling in time. I thank Dean Waterstone, Michael, where are you? For being with us and for your sterling leadership of the Loyola Law School. Every day through our clinics, through our centers, and through our collaborations, our faculty and students in partnership with our community are doing what we call creating the world we want to live in. I'm happy to welcome each of you to our dazzling Playa Vista Campus for the Breaking Barriers to Voting panel. And I thank you for joining us this morning for what promises to be an insightful discussion about what really is one of the most pressing issues in our society and one of the least discussed. So the ratio of importance to awareness with this issue is extraordinary. I thank our distinguished panelists from Common Cause, Disability Organizing Network, Equality California, and Silver State Equality, and Future of California Elections, exciting things going on there, for being part of the program, lending their voices and their expertise to this crucial discussion. I also share special thanks with somebody whom I was really proud to meet this morning, Carol Costello, who they tell me is the First Lady of LMU. And we thank our Regent, David Herbst. David, where are you? This man is like a Michael Cohen with ethics. He's a fixer. And so everybody knows David, and we love the work that he does for our society. And of course, the Coelho Center would not be possible and would not be as successful as it is without the Honorable Tony Coelho. Tony, thank you for being with us. Tony is an LMU alumnus. Tony is a former LMU student body president. He is a former member of the LMU Board of Trustees. He is an LMU honorary doctorate recipient, and he is well-versed in creating a better world. The impact he has had on the world is the kind of impact for which so many of us dream, where you have moved mountains and you have helped hundreds of thousands, ultimately millions of people live in a better world. So thank you, Tony. Another round of applause for Tony, and thank you for being with us. And my gratitude abounds for our guest speaker who will join us later this morning, the sort of maker of magic, the DNC chair, Tom Perez. You can applaud him when he arrives. As you likely know, our commitment at LMU to social justice and our devotion to creating a more equitable society for all is a hallmark of our institution. The Coelho Center upholds our values by protecting and serving citizens of the world. And of course, serving the world starts, as you know, in our communities with education and with policies, but it always requires continual learning and growth from and with each of us. And that makes your being here so important, that you are open to learning. That's a concept not the entirety of society necessarily shares with you. But our creation of a better world also requires action from each of us, and that can come in the forms of grassroots activism, volunteering in our communities, GOTV campaigns, debating, that may happen here soon. There's this also a concept called voting, and through all these we have a responsibility for those here, for those to come, and for the earth itself. Tomorrow, the eyes of the nation and the world will be with LMU as the Democratic candidates make their cases for why they should be the Democratic Party's choice for president. But every day we must fight to ensure that eligible citizens can express their choice through equal access to the voting booth. What could be more fundamental than that? So, I thank each of you for your dedication to this issue, and I am happy to turn the mic over to our phenomenal Dean of LMU's Loyola Law School. Please welcome Dean Michael Waterstone.
Hello, everybody. Hello. I hate going after President Snyder. So let me welcome everybody. Let me say a few thank yous. First, President Snyder, thank you for your support and leadership as we created this center. Every dean deserves a president who is as supportive as President Snyder is. It is absolutely amazing the level of commitment and support he has shown as we have created this. So Tim, thank you for your leadership and support. We are all grateful. I want to thank Catherine Perez, the inaugural director of the Coelho Center. Catherine, we're so appreciative of your energy, your creativity, your vision, your leadership, and really all that we've accomplished as we've gotten this off the ground. So thank you for all that you do. So the topic today is certainly near and dear to my heart. Voting is in many ways the most important right that we have. It's preservative of all other rights. If we don't have the right to vote, every other right that we have is truly in jeopardy. And the history of our country, the history of our democracy, in many ways is a success story. Over the period of our history, we have expanded the franchise continually to new and different groups of people. And that makes us better, it makes us more resilient, it makes us stronger. But the reality, and the reality is that what we're going to talk about today, we absolutely still have challenges. Too many groups face disenfranchisement at the polls. And this too is part of our history. Whether it's people with disabilities attempting to access inaccessible polling places, being directed into inferior voting options such as absentee ballots if they don't choose to go in that direction. Driver's license requirements, long poll lines. These are all things that have the ability to disenfranchise individuals, which truly does corrode our system of democracy. So I'm so excited that we get to have this conversation today. And of course, the driving force, the convener that did this, that brought us together, is Tony Coelho. Tim already said a few words about Tony. Tony was the majority whip in Congress. Tony was the architect of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And when you say it like that, it sounds like just a sentence on a bio line. But one of the great opportunities of my lifetime is getting to travel both our country and our world and see the ways that the Americans with Disabilities Act has made a difference in the lives of real people on the ground. And it doesn't mean there's not still work to be done. We're going to talk about that today. But it has had a transformative impact on our society and our world. And it's really been the honor of a professional lifetime to get to work with Tony, my friend, my mentor, as we try to improve the lives of people with disabilities and make the world a better place. So Tony, thank you for all that you've done and all that you have brought to our community. To learn a little bit more about Tony, but also the center, we have a video that we're going to show you to talk about the work that we've done, but also the work that we hope to accomplish.
I chose Loyola because I was having my seizures and didn't know what they were. I got kicked out of the priesthood seminary because canon law said if you have epilepsy, you can't be a priest. And then I couldn't get a job, and I became suicidal. And Loyola helped me turn my life around.
It is so amazing that the center is named after Tony Coelho because he is the main author of Americans with Disabilities Act.
I worked on the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and it was really interesting the overwhelming impact that it had among my colleagues. A lot of people came on legislation just because of the way people had been treated, like I'd been treated.
Tony is, many people know, is a force. He works harder to improve the lives of people with disabilities than anyone, and it's just a privilege to have him as a partner on this journey.
The Coelho Center is going to innovate, and it's going to bring together the best and the brightest leaders that currently exist to push the boundaries of disability law and policy.
We want to have fellowships that basically have students in each of the colleges working together with the deans of the colleges and working on a different disability project so that we bring these students understanding disability, working with the deans, having a project, talking about it.
As people with disabilities continue to face discrimination, continue to face barriers into their full integration in society, we at the law school and really the entire university are trained and excited to use our various tools to work on these challenging problems.
We're going to convene and bring together all the brightest leaders and minds that are thinking about disability laws and policies.
We have tried hard in the public arena to put hate in a bottle. And I think one of the purposes of our center is to deal with that, is to go right at it. It's very hurtful to me and to others when people dislike me just because of who I am.
At Loyola, we have a wonderful Jesuit tradition of meeting the world where it is. That's what this center is going to do. We are not studying law or engineering or business within the confines of an institution. We are going out and aggressively and with joy solving the world's problems, meeting people with disabilities where they are and bringing the entire resources of the university to bear on studying, on being compassionate learners, on formulating creative solutions to the world's challenges.
We all should be trying to get to know each other and to realize just because I have a disability, I can be very successful just like anybody else. And if you give me an opportunity to fail, then I might have an opportunity to succeed.
The challenges that people with disabilities face, we're going to work together across disciplines to formulate creative solutions to all of these challenges.
God's been good to me. I've had so many good things happen that I want to pay back. I want to give back, make life better for those of us with disabilities and have an impact. And that's what this center is all about. I want this to be my legacy.
So when we talk about voting rights, it's the mix of high-level policy, but also where the rubber meets the road is on the mechanics of how elections get administered. And these decisions, how these policies play out, are crucial to people's lives. And no one plays that space more than the Secretary of State. So we're so honored today to have Secretary of State Bowen with us. Secretary of State Bowen was the Secretary of State before Secretary of State Padilla. She had many accomplishments during her time in office, including launching online voting registration to make it more accessible, really thinking creatively about the future of California elections. She was supportive of voter accessibility on the advisory committee. And during her time as Secretary of State, she really broadened access to alternate formats of voter education materials so they could be ordered online. So Secretary of State, we're so grateful for your leadership and pleased that you're with us today. And we'd like to invite you to the podium.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. Let me put this in context. I think the framework that we can use for disabled voters applies to all voters. And I've always looked at this in 3 steps. First, we want to allow any eligible voter to register easily. Second, we want to allow any registered voter an easy way to cast a ballot. And third, we want to have all votes that are cast be counted as they are cast. So that has always been my framework for looking at elections. To that, I have to add that voters who are registered stay registered, and that the list of voters who are eligible actually includes all citizens who are eligible. These are not tests that I thought we would need in this country, but we clearly do. So that's my framework. Now, when I was thinking about what I wanted to say this morning, I asked someone at the front desk if I could have some paper. And they looked around at each other and said, "Oh, paper. Oh, I think we have some somewhere." And indeed, I got some paper. But this made me think right away about voters who are different from other voters, and this applies to all government services. If you require someone to go online to get information, to register, you are already limiting the pool of people who have access. And we don't often think about certain kinds of disabilities. Obviously, not having paper is not a traditional disability, but it's anything that can prevent someone from registering or voting. And the definition of that has changed over time. I think it began with looking just at voters who had a physical disability. And we began things like curbside voting. I'm now back to being a poll worker. I look at curbside voting, and it's ridiculous. You can't park outside the polling place. And certainly the mechanism for going out to the car is not sufficient. So we started with that. Then we began to look at voters who have hearing or vision issues, and on we go. I think that the next frontier in this is going to be looking at, as we age, voters who have dementia or who are beginning down that road, and asking ourselves, how long do people continue to be allowed to vote as they begin to evince symptoms of things like Alzheimer's and other kinds of dementia? So that's my prediction as to one of the things that we will be seeing in the future. We obviously have a lot of work ahead of us. It was wonderful as Secretary of State not just to work on the issues, but to allow myself to be blindfolded so that I could test the equipment that was going to be used for voters who had visual issues. And I learned a lot from that experience. And that was just from being blindfolded for half an hour. I thought differently about the entire world. So I'm grateful that everyone's come together to do this today. I think we need to remember that we are in California, so we start out ahead of the pack, although there are still places where we can learn something. Minnesota, I know, sends out teams who vote people in nursing homes and hospitals as a matter of routine. You don't have to apply for an absentee ballot to do that. Some states still restrict who can have an absentee ballot. I've been listening to Ulysses Grant's biography, and he could not vote in the first elections because he was not in his home state when it was time for. He was deployed in the military and he couldn't vote. So I will close with this. President Kennedy reminded us that democracy is never done. It is a work in process. We all have to continue our efforts and never be satisfied with where we are. Carry on.
Thank you so much, Secretary Bowen. Can we give her another round of applause? Okay, now I have the wonderful task of welcoming our panelists and moderator to the stage. I am pleased to introduce you all to Carol Costello. She's an award-winning journalist and former anchor and correspondent at CNN and HLN. Carol serves as the First Lady at LMU, and she teaches a broadcast journalism course in the LMU journalism program. Please join me in welcoming Carol Costello and our panelists to the stage.
Thank you so much, and thanks all of you for being here, because this is an important topic, one that's certainly not covered well enough in the media. In fact, media rarely discusses this because it's just too complicated, it's just too boring, and that's just so wrong. I'd like to thank Tony. Tony, I'd like to thank you for everything you have done for Americans with disabilities and all you have done for LMU. We love and appreciate you, all that you do. And we especially love that you're still in the fight because it's so necessary. Just this morning, in the Washington Post, the headline read, "Georgia purges 300,000 voters from the rolls." Just last week, it was Wisconsin that purged over 200,000 voters from the rolls. And just a month or two ago, it was Ohio that purged 200,000 voters from the rolls. 99 bills have been introduced in 31 states just last year. Critics say they are designed to diminish access to the polls. If true, this is decidedly un-American. But I bet that doesn't surprise you, right? Our panelists today are passionate about voter accessibility for everyone. And we have them to thank for fighting the good fight here in California. We're going to talk a lot about that this morning. So I'd like to introduce my panelists right now. Elizabeth Campbell is with the Disability Organizing Network. She works with elections officials to break barriers. Elizabeth, can you come to the stage? Thank you, Elizabeth, for being here. Kathy Fang is with Common Cause. She challenges, through lawsuits and other means, gerrymandering, voter ID, and voter registration rules. Kathy, could you come to the stage? Thank you. Astrid Ochoa is with Future California Elections. She brings communities together to break voting barriers. Her organization sponsors the Voters' Choice Act in California, and of course that will go into full effect in 2020. And I'd also like to welcome Tony Huang, who is stuck in traffic, and as soon as he gets here, someone will bring him up to the stage. He's with Equality California and Silver State Equality, and he fights to get members of the LGBTQ community out to vote. He was so successful in the 2018 midterms, he flipped a couple of seats in California, so we congratulate him on that. Okay, I'm going to take my seat now. Switch microphones. Thank you so much. I'll sit over here till Tony comes. Okay, can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, so we're going to talk for about 50 minutes in the formal way up here. And then after that 50 minutes expires, we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. So be prepared. We want many questions because, as I said, this is such an important topic. So let's start with the headline in the Washington Post, shall we? 300,000 voters purged from the rolls in Georgia. Ohio and Wisconsin did similar things. What exactly do you think is going on, Kathy?
We now know that there has been a concerted effort to link a number of different issues around voter access and redistricting to limit who can actually cast a ballot and have a meaningful vote. Unfortunately, that strategy is tied to trying to secure a partisan advantage or an advantage for a particular incumbent. And the concern is that in doing so, we do irreparable harm to our democracy at large. When hundreds of thousands of people are turned away, or when the laws are changed last minute in order to ensure that certain people who have always been eligible to vote suddenly have to cross 2 or 3 barriers in order to cast a ballot, or when redistricting is done in a way that manipulates the lines to give a benefit to one party or one incumbent, we are distorting our democracy. And
Well, I'm gonna
it clearly
push
is a part of a political strategy.
I just want to push back because critics do say it's a political strategy. The secretaries of state in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Ohio are all Republicans, just so you know, but they say that they are just purging people who have died from the rolls and makes it much more expensive to have people who are ineligible to vote on the rolls. So what's wrong with that?
So the way that we do it in California, I think, is the right way, which is that we do actively look through the list to make sure that if somebody has moved or if somebody has passed away, that those lists are updated by comparing them to other statewide databases or even federal databases. But the key thing is that we also give voters or their families the opportunity to respond and let us know, hey, actually, there might be a little bit of a glitch. This name is the same as that name. We're still alive. We still live here. Or maybe we just moved, but we haven't updated. There's plenty of reasons why people are legitimately allowed to vote. They need to be on the lists, but when they're taken off, all of a sudden, their right to vote has been fundamentally denied. And that's the biggest challenge, is that the way that those lists are being cleaned is having a disparate impact on certain populations, generally people who are younger, people who don't own their homes, who are apartment dwellers, and certainly people of color. And all of that seems to be targeted very clearly at people who also vote a certain way in order to affect the election outcome.
Does it also affect the disabled community, these voter purges?
I think particularly because people with disabilities have they fall into these categories, right? So people who tend to be apartment dwellers or who might have their records in some way sort of last name similar to somebody else's last name, they tend to fall into the same categories of people who are disparately impacted.
Critics also say that the purges involve people who haven't voted in elections for 7 years. So they kick those people off the voting rolls because they figure they're just not interested, or they've moved out of the state, or they can't find them, or they haven't responded. And again, they would say, why should these people be on the voter rolls costing the state money if they're not exercising their right to vote? And they haven't for 7 or 8 years.
The U.S. Constitution protects the right to vote to every single person. It does not matter whether you are active or you've decided to take a break. You may have all sorts of reasons for not voting in certain years because the candidates weren't appealing, life happened and you had a baby, right? You've moved, you know, things are tough. That is no reason to remove somebody from the rolls. And in fact, I think some of the protections that California has created really, I think, set the standard for what the country should be doing.
Tell us about the protections in California.
Yeah. You want to be able to look at current records from various databases to see whether or not things need to be updated. So people go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, for instance, because they're updating their license, and they might update their address or even their last name or other things, their status. That's the kind of thing that you'll want to constantly compare to. And in fact, actually, California has created a very active process of comparing those records. But again, before you remove somebody from any voter roll, you want to contact that voter and give them multiple opportunities to be able to indicate if we got it right or got it wrong. We have seen in states like Georgia, they've tried to remove hundreds of thousands of voters, and it turned out that other than in a very few number of cases, they got it wrong. And so they were about to disenfranchise several 100,000 voters all on almost a whim. And really, it's ultimately the voter's right to hold on to that ability to cast a ballot. And we need to always give that power and that right back to the voter to remove themselves if they want to, but not to be removed when they are still active and eligible voters.
And just to back up what you said, in the state of Ohio, they purged more than 200,000 from the rolls, but then they opened it up to the public. So advocacy groups went through the list, and they found 40,000 of those voters were indeed eligible to vote. So they were reinstated. So mistakes do happen, and there needs to be some sort of watchdog in place to make sure that everything's kosher.
I mean, there's plenty of people who will have similar names. Astrid Ochoa, you might find somebody who has a similar name who even is of similar age or even, similar birthday. And what I'll say is that our registrars here in California, I talk regularly to Dean Logan and Neil Kelly from Orange County and Los Angeles County, and what they say is that they spend a lot of detailed time looking to make sure that before anybody is removed, that they got it right. So even if you've got a similar name, even if you share a similar birthday, I want to be absolutely sure that if somebody's going to be removed from the registration lists, that it's because they actually have moved or have passed away or in some other way need to be removed.
And in talking about exact match signatures, right, that has to affect the disabled community, because if you have trouble writing, somebody might not be able to determine if that's exactly your signature, right?
Yeah, so our election officials here in California actually do a really great job of giving voters the benefit of the doubt, and there have been recent laws that require contacting that voter and giving them a chance to fix that signature. And so that is part of the process where, as Kathy mentioned, life circumstances change for everybody, and where you might be an avid voter one year, the next year you may not. And the more options we give voters to be able to participate in our democracy, regardless of where they are in their life, the more we're going to get those opportunities to engage voters. And so, yes, I had a baby 2 years ago, and I was able to become a permanent vote-by-mail voter. So I still got to participate, even though I couldn't make it to the polls on election day. And now with the transition to vote centers here in California, to vote centers to 15 counties here in California, including Los Angeles County, you can now vote on the weekends as well, up to 10 days before election day. So the more options voters have, and the more election administration meets the needs of voters, the more opportunities you create for voting.
Yeah, and just jump in, please. If you have something fabulous to say, jump in, because I want this to be more of a conversation than an interrogation by me, even though I enjoy that. I was thinking as I was doing research on this topic that people who are disabled, minorities, LGBTQ people, trans people, people with language barriers, together these voters number in the tens of millions. And yet so many feel disenfranchised, and so many are disenfranchised. I suspect we all have an idea of why this is, but I'd like each of you to tell me why you think this is. So we'll start at the end.
So first and foremost, I think I need to start with saying that people with disabilities are everywhere, and it's not just the disabled voter, it's the people around them, it's the people in their community and their families, and to say that just the disabled voter is this kind of voter is completely inaccurate and untrue. And I think, looking at us all up here today, of course we have different specialties. I work within people with disabilities and securing the right to vote, but the intersections of what all we do, everybody feels disenfranchised, whether they identify as having disability, within LGBTQ, person of color. So to say that a person with a disability as a voter feels disenfranchised for one reason, that is not something that I can say because I can answer to that effect because it's that person's own, feeling and own reasoning. I can talk endlessly about the physical barriers and the attitudinal barriers that prevent people from registering and from casting a ballot. But to feel disenfranchised, I think the only thing I can really comment on is if you're not invited to the table, you don't want to vote. And so having that lack of access at the ballot or registering, that I can say is reaping.
Well, you know, when you think of deliberate efforts to disenfranchise people who are disabled, who are among our most vulnerable voters, that's kind of despicable, right? So is it all about power from those who are doing the disenfranchising, or is it more than that?
So I've thought a lot in the last couple of days about, is there any concerted effort to purposely disenfranchise the disabled vote? We can see there are certain other types of voters who are, it's very clearly, you know, it's fact that they are being disenfranchised. And I could not answer that question to say, like, are people with disabilities of the disabled vote being purposefully barred? And it is within our own culture. It's just, we're not there yet. And I'm not entirely sure how to bring around this answer, but I know they can definitely speak. These ladies can speak much more to that.
I think Elizabeth brings up a good point, which is that a voter is a voter, and then somebody who has a disability is something that sort of sometimes you may be born with and sometimes it comes along. I'm sitting here with glasses that I now need to use to read anything. And so in order to vote.
That's an accommodation.
Yeah.
That's an accommodation.
And that is a disability because as I go to vote, if the print is written in something that's too small or without high enough contrast, I can no longer see the ballot. So I think thinking about people who have different kinds of, they're coming to the vote with different kinds of abilities is important. Let me take a step back and just say I think that in the past in California, but also in many states, election systems have been set up from the perspective of those who are abled and from the perspective of those who've always voted in the past. And so whether that is tied to a discriminatory intent or not, the impact is that it can have the effect of excluding certain people. Okay, and I'll say in some places there is intent. But I will say that in places like California, for instance, in Los Angeles, we continue to use a voting system where you have to insert a paper ballot into a little device and manually flip the pages in order to line up the candidate names with a marking device. That's a challenge on a number of different levels. Somebody who can't manually manage that ballot, somebody who does not read English, which is a gigantic population, will have to have a sample ballot that's translated and then try to match the candidate names and the ballot names. So right there, if you mismark by one bubble, you're off entirely. Your ballot is entirely off. And that's the kind of barrier that when you multiply that by hundreds of thousands, it can have a huge effect on the election. Now, to the question of whether or not there are active efforts to exclude, I'll speak from my own personal perspective as a woman of Asian American descent, that there has been clearly a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric. And we have seen in recent election protection efforts where we run hotlines to receive voters who are calling in to ask questions about, where's my polling place? And, can you verify whether or not I can cast a ballot? That we are increasingly getting phone calls in about people who are actively trying to intimidate voters from casting a ballot based on their assessment about whether they are legitimate voters. And that might be, hey, is your skin too dark? Do you speak with an accent? Do you look like you're Mexican or any other immigrant that is not a legitimate voter? Okay, and actively using their position of power, whether that's outside of the polling place or sometimes even sneaking in and getting in to become a poll worker and making distinctions and asking people illegitimately to show papers or show some kind of proof that they're allowed to be there. They do that for all voters. They do that for voters who they deem to be not legitimate. That is becoming increasingly, I will call those vigilantes, permitted because of the national rhetoric that's happening. Sort of a permission for people to try to bring their bias and their discriminatory intent into the polling place. In California, we have jealously guarded our election process as something that's nonpartisan. And I'll say that generally speaking, we try to root that out very quickly. But it's popped up in California too.
That's just crazy. Tony, welcome. We're glad to have you as part of our panel because you have a lot of important information to share with us. Along the same lines of those questions about why disenfranchisement happens, the Coelho Center poll found these extraordinary numbers that I want to share with you right now. It found the extended disability community makes up 60% of the population. Is that insane? 60%. That means a lot of disabled people are voting or could vote and wield tremendous power. 14.3 million disabled people voted in 2018. 14.3 million. That's more people, that's more than the Latino population voted. And it's just a little less than the African American population voted. That's incredible power. Like, might that be a reason for some disenfranchisement in that community?
Yeah, I wanted to add, voting is a happy thing. If you go to the polls on election day, people feel like they've accomplished something. They feel like, I have contributed to my community, I'm out here giving a voice to my community, I'm out here being seen. And when it's not happy is usually because there's been some barrier to that voter being able to cast their ballot. And my organization, we are a cross-sector, intersectional organization that brings together election officials, advocates, civil rights groups, civic engagement groups, to talk about how do we reduce barriers. To Kathy's point, the system is built by those that have perhaps a more able experience. And so when you bring together advocates for voters with disabilities, with limited English proficient voters, with election officials, you help create a system from the beginning that will serve all voters. And that's the vision, right? We don't want to create a system where then you tag on pieces so that voters can participate, but that a voter can participate however they wish, in the language they wish, with the assistive technology that they wish, independently. And that's a really important point because our systems need to change and adapt to the needs of voters to meet voters where they are. For example, we heard the point about, brought up by Secretary Bowen about paper and how that's outdated. Well, how many of you used to carry a quarter for the phone booths? And phone companies have adapted. We don't use that. And so our election system must also adapt to take advantage of the technology to make it easier for voters to meet their needs at whatever life moment they're in. And so that would help increase those opportunities to engage.
Interesting. Tony, I want to bring you into the conversation. You work to turn LGBTQ non-voters into voters in California. What are some of the barriers that people in that community feel as they go to the polls or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think, based on recent studies with the Williams Institute, LGBTQ voters are disproportionately unregistered to vote as compared to the larger population. And I think, particularly, up until recently, our community was not spoken to in the public sphere, and before that, outright hostile to our community. And I think particularly particularly on the Democratic side, candidates are really speaking to our issues. That's really motivated our community to really turn out to vote. Up until 2018, the last cycle, the LGBTQ community overwhelmingly voted for the Democratic candidate. I think we were, as a community, second to the African American community in terms of Democratic voters. And I think that is really because sort of the atmosphere that we live in with the current administration attacking the community, folks really see why it is important to vote. But I think
that surprises me because I look at the gay community as a powerful lobbying group who is very successful at getting members of that community out to vote. So,
And I think that, the community is not a monolith, right? We are a part of every single community that is out there. And I think, there is a perception that, the LGBT community is really made up of, cisgender, white, wealthy men. But obviously we are part of every single community. And I think where the gaps are where there are intersections of the LGBTQ folks, communities of color, folks that are experiencing poverty, homelessness, things like that. And that's where, for us, a lot of the barriers are. Nationwide, when these voter suppression laws are really targeting, folks of color, LGBTQ folks of color, trans folks of colors are really being disproportionately impacted because you're looking at poverty, discrimination, bureaucracy. When you need a photo ID law, if your photo ID does not match your gender identity, you can't vote, right? Same with if you are, experiencing the criminal justice system. You've been incarcerated for things like sex work or HIV criminalization, you're not allowed to vote in certain states. If you're, even here in California, even though the laws are really great in terms of voter access, the experience, particularly for trans folks, gender nonconforming folks, that, a poll worker is asking for their ID, if they don't present in the same gender expression as what's listed on the voter rolls, a lot of folks don't want to go into the voting booth to exercise their right to vote because they don't want to, feel that, not so much discrimination, but perhaps, ignorance in terms of how do we make the voting booth more inclusive of LGBTQ folks.
So when you approach potential voters, how do you convince them to go vote?
Yeah, I think it's, talking to folks of where they're at. For us specifically, even though California, in terms of legal rights, we have a lot of great things, looking at the national level, talking about why it's important to extend federal non-discrimination protections. People don't know that you can get fired just for being LGBTQ. In many states, there are no federal protections. Talking about, the onslaughts in terms of, the transgender military ban, things like that, that are really affecting our community, and using those hooks to encourage them to turn out, in November.
I want to touch a second on the American with Disabilities Act, because certain things had to be put in place by law at polling places to make it easier for disabled people to vote. Right now in the state of Georgia, that law is being used, critics allege, to turn people away from the polls, especially in largely African American districts. They're using the ADA to say, well, it's not up to code, so we're going to close them down. So in one largely African American county in Georgia, they closed 7 of 9 polling places. Now, the thing is, there were violations of the law. So how do you fix that problem, Elizabeth?
Could you be a little bit more specific on fixing which
problem?
There's multiple problems.
Well, it's interesting that that people who allegedly want to disenfranchise African American voters are using the Americans with Disabilities Act to accomplish that. Your thoughts on that?
So, since the ADA was introduced, there has always been an opposition to try to dismantle the ADA in some fashion, to say that that we just can't be accessible for XYZ reason. And I think that it was strategic within Georgia to do that, to use the ADA, claiming that things are inaccessible, and so we're going to put up our hands and say no. It was a scapegoat, and unfortunately, people with disabilities have been used as that scapegoat, saying that our accessibility and our need and our right to access is a burden on somebody else. The way that I would try to go about fixing that is going back to square one and saying, this is what's in the law, these are the regulations, this is the code, and it depends on where you are, in what county, in what state, and I can talk endlessly about Orange County, but it's unfortunate that happened, but in my heart of hearts, I know that there was the approach to use the ADA was not just to disenfranchise people with disabilities. There was much more behind it.
I mean, clearly, if the intent was to not only give voters who have disabilities, but also the African American voters who lived in and around that area, the ability to cast a ballot easily. What they would have done was A, bring those spaces up to compliance, or B, find a location that's still within the neighborhood that meets the requirements. If their goal is to get rid of a polling place so as to make it harder for both of those communities to cast a ballot, well, that's what they did. So I think that the intentions kind of play out from what the results are. When you find that your most maintained voting equipment, your least purged lists, your least likely to move polling places are all located in white, wealthy neighborhoods. And the ones that are moved around, closed down, have faulty equipment, and poll workers who don't know what they're doing, are all located in neighborhoods with people of color or people with disabilities or young people or LGBTQ communities. It's telling you exactly who they're targeting. The resources are moved away from communities that need it the most to the communities that are already voting. I'll just say one other thing that's an interesting dynamic that plays out in campaigns as well. So campaigns have limited dollars for who they're going to spend trying to contact voters. And so they generate these voter lists of people who vote 5 out of 5 times of 5 last elections, 4 out of 5 elections, 3 out of 5 elections, or 0 out of 5 elections. And guess who they spend most of their time talking to? They spend almost 100% of their dollars, if they've got limited dollars, talking to the people who vote 5 out of 5 times. And what that means is that consistently campaigns reinforce that division between who's talked to and who's not talked to. If you vote frequently, your mailbox is full of slate mail, and you're called like 3 times a day, and people are reminding you when the election day is and polling you on how you're feeling, and hey, do you need help getting to the polls? They know. But if you're the infrequent voter, not only are you not talked to by the campaigns, you're kind of actively left off of anybody's radar screen because they don't know how you vote. So you're an unknown factor, and so they're actively trying to keep you from participating. Add that to the fact that you might be much more likely to be purged from a list because you haven't voted very frequently, or any variety of other barriers that would prevent you from getting to the polls to vote. All of those cascade to sort of reinforce the votes and the vote nots, sort of a similar parallel to have and have nots, only we just keep reinforcing people who are the vote nots to say, you're not part of the party and we're not going to include you in that party.
In an effort to get more people to vote in the state of California, the Voters' Choice Act went into limited effect in California in 2018. It means the end of polling places and the birth of voter centers. As I said, its intent is to make voting easier, to get more people to vote. Astrid, I know you had a lot to do with that. So can you give us, was it a success in your mind, what happened in 2018?
Yeah, so my organization creates a policy table for discussion. We debate, we discuss, we disagree, we argue, we come back together, and the outcome is, thankfully, better policy ideas. And so we did not take a position on the Voters' Choice Act itself, but we did create a policy table for dialogue. And the rollout in 2018 was limited. It was 5 counties in California. In 2020, it's going to be 15, representing over 50%. So to evaluate the success of a bill on such limited data, I think would be a little bit too early. What we do know is that when you increase the options for voting, which the Voters' Choice Act does, you can vote by mail, vote at a drop box. You can vote, as I mentioned, up to 10 days before Election Day and all the way through Election Day. We also have same-day registration across California, not just in the Voters' Choice Act counties. And also, we now have no postage required for vote-by-mail ballots across California. Again, all of these items are to set up voters for success, to reduce the barriers to voting. It's really hard to get a stamp nowadays. So that's an important point, which discourages some folks from transitioning to vote by mail. And so, I think what we really need to see is how does this policy cut across the board, right? So how does it serve voters with disabilities? How does it serve limited English proficient voters? And one of the great features of the Voters' Choice Act is that it encourages public engagement. And so for the first time, voters are invited to help shape their election administration plans. So after the first 2 years of an election under the Voters' Choice Act, the Elections Office will hold public comment and engage the public to see how we change it. And then every 4 years after that law, voters continue to have that opportunity to engage with their elections office. So I think that there are a lot of features that are very promising in the Voters' Choice Act in the sense that the customers that are using the service are being invited to help shape and to express how to best serve them. So I think it's really exciting to see these changes happening in California. I think 2020 will be an important year to truly give us a picture of how successful this policy is. And I just want to add one more thing, which is we just need to make sure that we fund our elections. If we're committed to democracy, we have to make sure that election officials have the resources they need to provide those excellent services.
The LA Times did a story on the participating counties in 2018. It said it only saw a 3% uptick in the number of people who voted, which doesn't sound like a lot. So I just wanted you to respond to that. And does that tell us anything, since this is
I'll
such
take a 3% uptick any day. Come on now. Like, an uptick is an uptick.
What is it, we're at 19 million voters?
Yeah,
So
I mean,
3%
in
of
California,
7% uptick in Latino voters, young voters, and Asian American voters.
when you see a 7%, it doesn't sound like a lot, but in California, that's millions. So I'll take that. I think that every increment that we can get to get people to participate makes sense, and especially because we're now building a voting system that's thinking forward. We've had a voting system that, like, up until now was really designed, I think, kind of with the 1700s in mind, right? Like, I mean, this idea that, okay, we're gonna look at where you live, and then we're gonna assign you to a polling place that's close to where you live, you got to vote there on a single day, which is a Tuesday, which everybody's wondering, like, why, right? And these days, what I think what the recognition is let's give people a range of choices. First, when you vote, not just on a Tuesday, because we're all busy, and so my day off, if I'm working in the restaurant industry, might be Monday, right? If I'm in a certain religious community, Saturday might be the day that's my day off. Sunday might be the other. So honestly, it's giving them the whole range of that week. Okay, before. Second is, I can vote in a vote center that's close to me, or I can just get online and find, hey, I'm driving from here to work, I gotta drop off my kids, and so somewhere along the way, aha, there's a vote center there. Pop into the vote center that is on my route along the way. They can pull up all my information, voila, you can vote at that location. Maybe on a particular day, because I've got a meeting that's a little bit farther out, I'm totally off route and I'm driving to someplace that I've never been to before. Also okay to vote. Maybe I just moved and I forgot, oh my God, I didn't re-register and I didn't change that information. Again, the beauty is you can stop into a vote center, update that information instantaneously, and now you can be registered to vote. All of those things just feel right for the 21st century, and I think that they respond to, I think, where new voters and old voters are going to be demanding. We just expect that kind of on-demand ability to vote when we're ready to vote.
Well, you know, there are always doomsayers and critics. And as you said, Astor, the real test is going to be in 2020, right? Especially in LA County with its 5.4 million voters. Critics wonder if people will be able to easily find the voting centers instead of their polling places. There's so many people and there's so much traffic and so much confusion sometimes just over the simplest things, especially in Los Angeles, as you know.
Can I make a comment about the 3%? So I'm gonna lean back on my registrar of voters, Neil Kelly in Orange County. I'm the co-chair of the Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee, so I work closely with him and his team. And he wholeheartedly believes, and now I do too, is when that statistic came out that, oh, there's only this much voter turnout, and we all thought, you know, those of us who are working within the voting sphere is, oh my gosh, that seems like nothing. But going back, and what Neil is telling us and telling voters in Orange County is that we're changing voting behavior by going to the vote center model. We can't expect these overwhelming numbers to say that it works and it's great, because it's a stagnated approach. It's 5 counties now. Some are going hybrid. It's 15 right now. It would be great to have the entire state by 2022 or 2024, but for the 3%, with Kathy, I'll be like, heck yeah, I'll take that 3%. But I don't want to have us just focus on that and say like the Voters' Choice Act isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing, because it is. There are so many, Astrid touched upon the different ways to be able to cast your ballot, but there's so much within the Voters' Choice Act that we haven't even touched upon right now that are ensuring and really giving people the opportunity to cast their ballot and be involved within their elections like never before.
No, you are right. It's hard to change people's behavior. I think that with 2020 coming up and, the momentous election it will be, that people are concerned that it won't work as well.
Yeah. So how many people live in LA County? Okay. You are all now ambassadors of the Voters' Choice Act. Implementing a reform as big as the Voters' Choice Act is bigger than any one agency can take. Dean Logan, our Registrar Recorder, County Clerk, has been a great leader in working on a transition to a voting model, frankly, for 10 years. And so this wasn't just a quick response to a change in a policy. It was a very thoughtful process to make sure that this new voting system is going to serve all LA voters, regardless of where they live, that they're going to have that opportunity. We have a very large county. We have a very complex electorate. It's not easy, and I think it's important to recognize that we all have a role in strengthening our democracy by sharing what we learn today, by connecting with other voters that are not going to take the time to learn their new voting options. And that's the vision of our network, Voters' Choice Los Angeles, that we manage. It's a nonprofit network of nonpartisan organizations working just on voter education, trying to understand how a new voting model changes GOTV, how a new voting model changes voter education, and recognizing that there's new skills that are needed, there's new partnerships that need to be formed, and that we do need the funding to do this successfully.
And, if this is successful, this could be the model for the nation, right? And that would be exciting.
We're a day off from the presidential debates, and I'm hoping that at least one of the questions is really thinking forward to ask those presidential candidates, right, each one of them, will they commit to modernizing our voting and election system so that our election process is inclusive, not exclusive, one that really thinks about people from all walks of life and how we build an election system that fundamentally embeds the idea that everybody has a right to vote, and that we're going to make every effort possible to bring people into that amazing family of people who participate and make our American democracy vibrant.
There's so much contrary information out there, because I'm sure if you asked anybody, no matter what their political stripe, they would say it's important to get people to the polls, it's important to vote, it's democracy. But there was an interesting editorial in the Wall Street Journal, and it was talking about voter suppression and what a myth it was, and this is the reason that it gave. It said Black and Latino turnout nationwide in 2018 hit a record high. Despite voter ID and new registration laws, the turnout increased 13.4% among Latinos, 11.4% for African Americans. So Republicans are saying, you guys are all a tad hysterical about this voter suppression stuff. Like, what more do you want?
Every step of the way, there has been litigation, there has been voter action, there's been pushback to try to make sure that these crazy voter suppression laws are not put into place, or that we can ameliorate the effects. And it's only because of that activism from people from every walk of life that we've been able to push back and ensure that people who want to vote can still cast a ballot. It's not for lack of some of these political operatives trying to suppress the vote. It's because the people have risen up and said, hell no, this is our right and we're going to take it. So I'll say this, To the extent that people who believe that you should institute strict voter ID laws or purge lists or use any other kind of shenanigan to manipulate the legal system so that people cannot vote, what you're going to face is Americans who stand up for and don't take for granted that ability. So thank you very much, because I think that it's woken a lot of people up to be participants.
And Tony, I also wanted you to address that because the Wall Street Journal editorial also said Democrats picked up 40 House seats and 9 governorships. You flipped a district in California or 2. So how would you respond to them where it's like this voter suppression stuff? Come on, what more do you want? This is amazing what you guys did.
I mean, I think it's, it's, to Kathy's point, it's all in coalition, right? I mean, I think, particularly in some of these states that are more restrictive, this was in light of those laws. It was working in coalition, with communities of color, with LGBTQ folks, people with disability, really working in coalition to sort of see what's happening and fighting back against those laws. And I think, 2018 was a good, hopefully an indicator of what's to come for 2020, and continuing to sort of exercise people's right to vote and really sort of, use their democratic right to sort of push back on these things that folks have seen that's happening.
So I'd just like to end our part of the conversation with what's going to happen in 2020 and whether voters will be enthusiastic and what you have to look out for as people go to the polls. So, Kathy, I'll start with you.
I would be floored if 2020 didn't have record-breaking voter turnout and participation, because regardless of which side you are on the political spectrum, I think the conversation has come to a point where participation is an absolute necessity if people care about the direction that our country is going to be taking. I will say that there are a lot of advocates on the ground who've been working night and day to make sure that certain efforts to try to, for instance, weaponize the census or to politicize redistricting or to manipulate the voting laws to suppress votes are really having a positive effect in pushing back on those efforts, right? And so I think that voters realize every step of the way our democracy is one that is vital and needs vigilance in order to protect it. And that starts with the very simple but universal act of registering to vote and casting a ballot. So I think a lot of people are going to show up, and we're going to see hopefully a change in the way that people approach voting, not just as a duty or not just because, I'm going to slog through the snow or through the rain or through the bright sunshine of Los Angeles to cast a ballot, but because I actively want to take care of my country, and this is one way of showing that I care.
What are you most concerned about in 2020, Astrid?
Well, like I said, my organization is leading a project around Voters' Choice Act implementation, and of course my concern is that voters are not going to know about the new options. So my call to you and to all that live in Voters' Choice Out County is vote early. Every day is Election Day, February 22nd through March 3rd, and leave Election Day for those that are just going to be hearing about it on that day. So, we have options in California. I mentioned some of the laws. Let's take advantage of them. Let's make voting fun and bring back that spirit.
Elizabeth? Your biggest concern in 2020 as far as voting is concerned?
Similar to Astrid's point is just the everyday voter is just not going to know the changes. And right now we're in such a delicate time where over 50% of registered voters in the state are going to be voting at a vote center, are going to be getting the vote by mail ballot, when some of them have never gotten a vote by mail before. I'm very excited, but I'm also nervous excited because it's really on us, the people who, like myself, who's in the grassroots on the ground, to tell our consumers, our community, family, everybody that this is happening and this is changing, and it's a good thing. So to be able to say these are the options, and to go cast your ballot, and there's so many new and innovative things about our elections processes that are happening right now. I just hope that people take advantage of it and appreciate all of the blood, sweat, and tears that's gone into making this whole process happen.
Tony, your concerns?
I think, for us in 2020, ensuring keeping up the momentum created from 2018, I think, particularly at times for our community at least, folks feel that, California is a, deep blue state, with the top of the ticket, there may be some voter apathy, but, putting their vote early, and then sort of, mobilizing their broader network to volunteer, making sure they cast their ballot, because it doesn't just, obviously the White House matters, but also there's a number of important congressional seats, state house seats, local elections that are all very important, that really matter to the day-to-day lives of our community. So making sure that, folks aren't apathetic, because they feel that they're in a Democratic area.
So how do you do that? Do you walk door to door? Do you use the internet? All of the above?
All of the above. I mean, I think one thing, we have nearly 1 million members across the state where we, do physical slate cards. We hit them with digital ads. We do calls, in specific targeted areas. Social media, things like that, where we really encourage, folks to sort of, spread the word and make it really a community effort. Where folks are exercising their right together in sort of social accountability.
Okay, so now I'm going to open it up for audience questions. We'll have about 15 or 20 minutes for that. So hopefully you've had your questions ready, and I'm ready for the first one. Someone have a question?
Yes. My question is about voter education. There's a lot of information out there that is not accessible to individuals with disabilities. Namely not closed captioned, or having a ASL or American Sign Language version. Many deaf people, ASL is their first language and English is their second language, so I would like to see that information translated into the native tongue, if you will, of deaf people as well. We have low vision individuals who need auditory description. So there's a lot of room for improvement in making education, voter education, more accessible to all communities.
Elizabeth, would you like to take that?
So I guess it's more of a comment. One, I am right there with you, trying to make sure that every I is dotted and T is crossed in terms of access. I've fought so hard to have open captions on our videos in Orange County. Not closed captions, open captions, and that's the kind that you can't take off. They're ingrained in the video. But there are so many nuances in what access looks like, and it means different things to different people. So I really appreciate your comment, and I would encourage any voter with a disability or anybody in the community to be able to get involved in their election administration plan with their elections office and demand that access, demand it because it is their right, and to fight for it, because if you push hard enough, they will absolutely do it.
I'll just add that for Voters' Choice Act counties, the counties are required to have committees for voters with disabilities and limited English proficient voters so that they can consult with the voters as they develop that plan. Additionally, under Secretary Bowen, we did have a state committee for voters with disabilities to really look at it from the state level, and then that was expanded to also have a state language advisory committee on language access. So there are avenues to continue advocating for these increased services, and I know I sound like a broken record, but if we really want to have the best elections, we have to fund them.
Next question.
Hi. Excuse my ignorance on this issue. The last time that I checked, I think, was several years ago, so I'm wondering if you know any updates. For folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, what is your stance on accessibility for them to vote? And I know one specific issue because it affected my sister, who had a conservatorship, and through that conservatorship here in California, she was stripped of her right to vote. And then several years ago, I think either there was a law or something passed that overturned that, so folks like my sister were able to vote again. But I think they had to go in front of a judge in order to actually retrieve that right. So that's a specific thing. What's the update on sort of that policy? And then more generally, what are some of the major debates right now on the issue of getting folks with intellectual and developmental disability to be able to vote?
I can absolutely comment on the conservatorship section of it in regards to the IDD or intellectual and developmental disability groups who are organizing around voting, I can absolutely connect you with folks who are doing that on the ground. I'm kind of a generalist, but I want to go back to the conservatorship situation because I get that question a lot. And in California right now, you can vote if you are conserved. You can only, your ability to cast a ballot, to register to vote, to cast a ballot, any of the above can and only be taken away from you by a judge. And that was changed recently before my time working within disability rights. And so for me, it's anybody who's conserved can vote. So for folks who have a little bit of the prior history knowledge, but now, absolutely, in the state of California, that is what it is.
I'll add sort of an interesting nuance to that, which is as some of the counties have been moving towards the vote center model, and in some counties, not Los Angeles, but other counties, are automatically voting every single voter a ballot. What's interesting is that there's an additional layer to that, which is allowing for, in common parlance, we're calling them pop-up voting sites. And a lot of the counties are really thinking hard about sort of where to put those pop-up voting sites, right? At places where people congregate a lot, but also at places where there's the greatest need, right? So Los Angeles County just went through a process where they said, hey, if we're going to have some of these temporary voting sites, are there places where there are centers that serve certain communities, right? Whether that's a language access community or a community that has a particular disability, right? Where we can bring a mobile voting location to that location so that it's easy for people to vote and they don't even have to kind of make a whole lot of effort to come to a vote center. But the other thing about vote centers that makes it nice is that instead of trying to schedule the disability access transit pickup, right, just for the Tuesday, because you now have up to 10 days to be able to cast that ballot at any one of a number of voting locations, it also makes planning for voting a lot easier, right? And sometimes planning for voting means having somebody who can come with you, somebody who can pick you up, somebody who can be there to bring you to the polling place or to even help you kind of go through that ballot that gets mailed to your house. Those are all really important access points that allow people with varying kinds of ability to be able to get through that election process in a way that doesn't assume that there's only one way to vote.
Hello. I was just wondering about whether you believe removing the barriers to voting will re-enfranchise those people, or extra steps need to be taken besides just kind of the structural supply side. And then how do we measure our effectiveness in taking those steps?
Yeah, so voter education is a big piece of any policy, right? Even if reforms happen, if the voter doesn't learn about their new options for voting, they're not going to be able to take advantage of that. So voter education is the next piece. It isn't just about passing policy, it's about working to make sure that voters are served by the new practices in elections. And then data collection is incredibly important in order to understand who is being served by the policies and unfortunately sometimes who is being left behind by the reforms. So working with local researchers to collect that data, I know that it is a challenge sometimes to collect data for voters with disabilities. Similarly, for African American community, this is always a question around like how do you measure in a way that's really going to be true, LGBT as well. And so for these populations, for advocates, I think it's important to partner with researchers to make sure that we get creative ways to evaluate how policies are impacting our communities.
Yeah, I heard two parts to your question, right? One is sort of beyond removing barriers, how do we just proactively increase access, right? And so let's use the voter registration as sort of one piece of that, right? Obviously, the reason why we have voter registration instituted in the US is partly grounded in our history of wanting to decide who gets included and excluded, let's be honest, right? But in California, oops, I went my glasses that help me with my disability, but So in California, we adopted the California motor voter law, which is our version of an automatic voter registration law that works with the Department of Motor Vehicles to find out who is eligible to vote, and if they are and they have not opted out, that they're registered to vote, right? There are other kinds of proactive things that we could build into our law to really be at the forefront. To give an example, once somebody has completed serving time in prison and they've completed all other legal requirements, is there a possibility that they could simply be brought into the voter rolls because they're now eligible, as opposed to making them separately go and register? Similarly, the question that the woman asked, if you were not registered because prior law didn't allow for people under conservatorship to do that, are there ways to bring people into the voter registration rolls without making them go through an extra step of proving their eligibility? I'll take one step further, which is to ask the question, because I heard you use the word supply versus demand, and I think that's an interesting way to think about it, right? Yes, we can remove all the barriers so that it's easy for you to go to vote, but if you don't feel like you have choices on the ballot or interesting kind of races, or people aren't speaking to you, or you didn't get that extra knock on the door to kind of make you feel included, can we change the dynamics of that part of the elections? Some of the things are structural things that we can change, and I'll say that I believe that changing the way that California draws district lines has made some of those elections a lot hotter. And for once, incumbents didn't take for granted that they were a shoo-in, so they had to fight really hard. Or there are a lot more open seats, and Tony can speak to this. Some of those open seats were so hotly contested that it was no longer a given that one party or another would win. What does that mean? It means that campaigns do change their behavior, because now if they have to fight tooth and nail for every single voter, they're going to go down from the 505 voter to the 405 voter, and maybe they'll even talk to the voter who's the infrequent voter, right? They've got to get every single person as a potential voter involved, because that's how close the margins are. I think that that's healthy for our democracy. And the last piece that California has started to work on is campaign finance. One of the hardest things, and I know anybody who's ever tried to run for an office, I'm sure that Deborah Bowen, you've experienced this too. Running for office, you go in with the most noble intentions. I'm going to change this policy. This is what I care about. I care about my constituents. And all of a sudden you realize you have to pay for ads and mail and consultants, and that bill starts to add up. And where do you get that money from? Unfortunately, in California, as in most places, most of that money comes from private interests. So maybe you've got a lot of constituents who want to donate some money, but a lot of that comes from special interests. And so the way that we fund campaigns is oftentimes driven by people who have an interest in the outcome because they've got, a corporate or other business interest. So can we change that dynamic so that if we allowed for people to fundraise in a different way, would it bring in more candidates, which would bring in more vibrancy of choice, which would then change the way that campaigns behave because they feel like they got to fight for every vote. You saw that with AOC when she campaigned, because she had to fight for every vote, all of a sudden there was a much more inclusive conversation. That's what we need to figure out. How do we make every election an inclusive conversation?
Can I make a quick comment about the barriers? Because I think sometimes we tend to get ahead of ourselves trying to answer and solve all the problems. And one thing that I've come across time and time again is as you're trying to solve and remove barriers, you inherently create others. And this is a call to action for those who are interested in voting and in the elections process, is to get involved and contact your local elections office and become a member. If there is a voting accessibility advisory committee, if not, make one. You can get involved in so many different ways to ensure that maybe if this barrier was taken away, but it was created for you that nobody had even thought of, it goes way past the physical barriers and the attitudinal barriers. And so I just want to make that point that yes, we can try to solve all the barriers, but we need to be mindful and encourage voters to be involved, to be able to watch out for the new ones.
And that will, I'm sorry, that's our last question. I'm very sorry. Thanks all of you for sharing such important information and taking your time out of a busy day, I'm sure, to educate all of us on our voting rights and voter suppression and all things important. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, that was a great job. So thank you, Carol, and thank you all the panelists for focusing it in. You know, a lot of times we decide that our vote's not really that important. Let me bring up one statistic for you. 2% or 3% increase in California is a million votes. Let's just look at the 16 elections. The total vote count in 3 states, that made a difference in that presidential race was 78,000. That's all 3 states. So when you start to break it up into how many in one particular state or another, it is not a big number. And so what has to happen is that we've got to knock down all the barriers. I agree with all that as been spelled out. But the other side of it is we got to get our people in the disability community and other communities, but our people in the disability community to take advantage of those things that we're making happen. Because if we don't get out to vote, it comes back to us. But we need to knock down the barriers that are there. It's obvious that what the attitude of people is what's critical. If your attitude is that you want everybody to participate, then voter suppression wouldn't be an issue. So if you want to limit certain people for whatever reason to not vote, most of the times it's really political. They want to eliminate certain people who vote against what their interest is. That has to be eliminated. That has to be exposed. We've got to turn that around. So we in the disability community, and I stress this a lot, we in the disability community want the same right as everybody else has. We don't want anything more than they have. We want the same right that they have. We want to be able to vote like they vote. And so that's what we got to keep stressing, and our community has to be aggressive and turning out. So thank you very, very much for coming and being here. And now it's my honor to introduce a great friend, someone who has been involved in this issue for a long, long time. As the original author of the ADA, it's a law that has had a huge impact, but a law is a law. It's on a piece of paper. What really makes the law work is enforcement of that law. So Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department has the jurisdiction in making sure that the laws are enforced. And when Tom Perez was the head of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, he did more for the ADA than anybody else that has ever handled it. I know that because I'm very involved in that issue. And so a lot happened, and he started going after states, cities, corporations, and so forth, who were the problems, and that's critical. Then Tom became Secretary of Labor, and in the first month of being Secretary of Labor, the President Obama turned to him and said, why don't we go ahead and do an executive order on the Federal Contractors and Subcontractors Act. What that meant was that people of color, women, and people with disabilities were required, the corporations were required to include them. But what happened is that there was an identity of women and people of color, but there wasn't a definition of disability. And there wasn't information, census data, that says where people with disabilities are located. And so we got all that done, and Tom led an effort with Valerie Jarrett, with President Obama, to get that in place. In the first year that it was in place, over 400,000 individuals with disabilities were included. And that is the type of thing we need to keep working on and so forth. So Without further ado, Tom has been a tremendous chairman of the Democratic National Committee. And one of my favorite decisions that he's made is that tomorrow night at Loyola Marymount University, the Democratic debate is taking place. And so I love him for that because LMU means everything to me. So Tom Perez.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here at LMU. Full disclosure, I went to high school at Canisius High School, Buffalo, New York, St. Peter Canisius. I got all too familiar with a concept called JUG. Don't know if any of y'all know that, but yes, any of you who went to a Jesuit high school understood JUG, which stood for Justice Under God. And I will stop there because I could give you a lot more chapter and verse, but then you would be asking, how are you so familiar with JUG? And you probably have figured out the answer to that already. It's a real honor to be here. And over the last few days, I had the good fortune of spending a lot of time with your leadership. I see John in the room here. And we were able to come to a mutually agreeable resolution with the service workers here. And when I first started working on this Friday, and this is not my first rodeo in the area of labor negotiations. You know, the DNC, you got all these, our job is to elect Democrats up and down the ticket, and you have a job description, and every job description you'll ever see in life has this thing at the end that says, other duties as assigned. So over the past few days in that category of other duties as assigned, put on my old hat. And the reason we were able to settle it is because of the absolute alliance and agreement on values. And what I saw from the get-go of my conversations with John is that this university is committed to the dignity of work. And we were able to reach a resolution because the Ignatian values were put into action. And so I'm really happy. I think this is win-win. I firmly believe that we need to do more often what we just did, which is demonstrating that we can do well by our workers, well by our businesses, and well by our values. And that's exactly what we did. So, John, thank you for your help. Thank you for your engagement. Loyola really stepped up, and we were on the phone all hours of the night, morning, et cetera. And the commitment to getting it done was very real. And I am thrilled to be here. It's going to be a great debate tomorrow night. It's a solemn day today. And there's nobody who runs for Congress on a platform of, I want to go and impeach the president. But you do take an oath to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States. And when you have a situation here where we have such an abuse of power, you know, Ben Franklin, you know that famous quote, you know, when he was coming out of the convention and they had built this fledgling republic. Is this going to be a republic or is this going to be a monarchy? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. And they wrote articles of impeachment. And the articles of impeachment, really the number one thing they were concerned about when they wrote it was foreign interference. That was what their concern was. Foreign governments coming in, especially in a fledgling democracy. To put a thumb on the scale. And, you know, for me, as I sit and reflect on that, and I apologize for digressing from the matter at hand, and we're going to get right to it, but it's hard not to discuss the elephant in the room. I'm not surprised that no Republicans will support it. I'm profoundly disappointed at that fact, but the world in which we're living right now, it doesn't surprise me. What really does irk me as much as anything is the unwillingness to say that it's even wrong. Okay, I'm not going to vote for impeachment, but this is bad behavior. They can't even say that. You know, JFK once said that the most noble virtue is courage. And they don't have the courage to say it's wrong to keep kids in cages. They don't have the courage to say that it's wrong to pay someone $7.25 an hour. They don't have the courage. I mean, cyberbullying a 16-year-old climate activist when you're a 70-something-year-old president, that seems like conduct unbecoming anyone. But they don't have the courage to say that's even wrong. And that's unfortunately where we are. And that's why these debates are so important. That's why this primary process is so important. And I'll tell you, one person who's been just remarkably important and impactful in my life is the director of this center, the namesake. When you think of the Americans with Disabilities Act, you think of Tony Coelho. When you think of the ADA, you think of Dick Thornburg. When you think of the ADA, you think of Steny Hoyer. Those are three of the titans, and I'm so appreciative of this university for recognizing Tony's historic leadership in this issue. And, you know, I hear a lot of talk about taxpayers and, you know, people, we need to lower taxes. And I often say, you know, I seldom meet people who say, I want to be a taxpayer, I want to pay more taxes. I meet a lot of people with disabilities who say, I want to be a taxpayer, I want to work, and you've made it hard for me to work. And, you know, we do make it unduly and unfairly hard. Oh, I got a job. Oh, I'm going to lose my health care. That's a Hobson's choice that should never be required to take place. And Tony has done more to educate me and cajole and inspire than anyone I can think of. And when people ask, what do you miss most about your old job? That's an easy question. It's helping people at scale. You know, when I became labor secretary, it wasn't 3-4 weeks in, and we had this rag on the employment of people with disabilities that, frankly, had been wallowing. It was on life support, to be frank with you. It was over at the White House, and we needed to push it across the finish line. And two of the most important people that enabled us to push it across the finish line were Valerie Jarrett and Tony Coelho. And what did this reg do? It made employers do something audacious. Treat people with disabilities with dignity. And one of the employers who was the most adverse and actually was part of a lawsuit against this reg ended up being one of our best advocates 2 years later because he had a light bulb moment. Why? Because he saw the workforce and he realized, I am squandering an opportunity to avail myself of human capital that can make my business work. And so sometimes you kind of got to hold a figurative gun to their head to make them do the right thing. And that's exactly what happened there. But that's why elections matter, folks. Because when you elect the right people, good things can happen to good folks at scale. When it doesn't, people suffer at scale. And from the moment I entered government, making sure we empower people with disabilities has just been part of our moral compass, part of our DNA. You know, the Olmstead decision in 1999 was, we thought would be the Brown versus Board for the disability rights movement. And the Olmstead decision, for those of you who may want a refresher, stands for the proposition that the unnecessary institutionalization of people with disabilities is a form of discrimination under the ADA. And I was at HHS at the time with a good friend named Bob Williams, and I know Tony knows Bob well. Bob is a remarkable friend, colleague, a person with cerebral palsy who has been one of the great thought leaders in this area. And when I got back to the administration in 2009, one thing that was clear, which is that Olmstead enforcement had been moribund, to be polite, in the Bush II era. Although now I think I love George W. Bush. It's a weird world when we're waxing nostalgic, but I digress. And the And there was an imperative there, and we did more work in the Olmsted context than ever before in allowing people to work. One of our first cases was actually in Georgia, where Olmsted was. And it is so inspirational when you see people being able to realize their highest and best dreams. That's what it's all about. That's what the role of government is being a catalytic force so that people can realize their highest and best potential. That's what the ADA was about. We've all too frequently focused way too much on the first 3 letters of that word disability and not enough on the last 7 letters. And that's what the ADA did, that's what our regs did, and that's what a lot of other executive action that has been either undone or watered down was designed to do. And so that's why I love my job now, because you know what, folks? We got to win elections at scale. And what we're doing here, and what we have been doing from the outset, is making sure we put the issues involving the disability community front and center in what we do. And one very concrete example is the choice and the process that we use to choose a convention city. We have a site selection team. And never before have we had a person on that team at the DNC whose sole job was accessibility. That person is Ted Jackson. Ted was just there a minute. There he is. Yeah, that guy right there, Ted Jackson. Ted was on the committee from the outset. Because here's what happens, and you all know this. You're getting ready to do something big, and all of a sudden, a month or 2 beforehand, oh my God, what about the disability issues? And you start thinking about it in that sprint to the finish line, as opposed to what do we do at the outset? And so after every visit to every city that we went to, we got reports. And Ted's reports were always the most voluminous. Isn't that right, Ted? And Ted would always spend an extra 2 days there. He'd get on the buses. He'd having conversations with tech companies, because it isn't simply physical accessibility. It's so many other aspects. He'd go to hotels. Every aspect of the convention experience we want to make sure is a spectacular experience, because we know we have fallen short in the past. And I use that as a simple example, but it's an important example, that we are committed, and we express that commitment from the outset, to make Milwaukee the most disability rights accessible experience in the history of our DNC conventions. That is critically important. And then let's segue to this conversation about the right to vote, because I had the privilege in my capacity as the head of the Civil Rights Division to do a lot of work in the voting context. And I'll tell you, one of my favorite people, we talk a lot about the presidency and what we have to do there, but our mission is to elect Democrats up and down the ballot from the school board to the Oval Office. And we had, 2 years ago, we had 15 Democratic governors. Now we have 24. We now have, for the first time in many years, the majority of state attorneys general are Democrats, and one of the best is my good friend Javier Becerra. And we have made great progress with secretaries of state. And I'm here to tell you, one of the most effective secretaries of state, Madam Secretary, having had big shoes to fill, is your Secretary of State, Alex Padilla. And I work with him regularly. And one of the best things we can do to empower people with disabilities is to make sure there's accessibility writ large. Making sure that we have automatic voter registration, making sure we have vote by mail, making sure that if you have a vision impairment, that vote by mail still works for you, making sure that you have the requisite ability to have people help you. One of the voter suppression tools that we see in states across the country is literally creating barriers to transport people to polling sites. And if you can't get there, you can't vote in these states, because they don't have the early voting and the vote by mail that you have elsewhere. And the thing to understand, and this is harsh, but this is true, if everybody voted who was eligible to vote, we would win at scale. And the other side knows that. And that's why people wonder, Tom, why do we have voter suppression in this country? That's why. I mean, in Texas, your concealed carry permit is a permissible form of ID. to vote. Your University of Texas ID or your Prairie View student ID is not a permissible form of ID. You got to travel 140 miles in some places in Texas to get an ID. That's if they're open, and they're open intermittently. It would be an injustice to all banks around the country to compare the hours of getting ID to bankers' hours, because it isn't even that. These are the barriers that we see. And we see, and we continue to see even more barriers. You saw in Wisconsin, if you've been following, in the last few days, the purging of over 200,000 voters. That's what they're trying to do. You saw in Georgia, they implemented a requirement that your ID had to match your ID that you presented had to match your ID in the voter file precisely. So I'm Thomas E. Perez. If it had said Thomas E. Perez in one and Thomas Perez in the other, that would have been insufficient. Why did they do that? They did that because it had a disproportionate impact on communities of color, and they didn't want them to vote. Ballot order is a huge issue. Ballot order can have up to a 6% effect on outcomes in elections. And we just won, and if you have a time and you're a geeky person like me, read the decision in a lawsuit that we helped. We are a plaintiff in that lawsuit in Florida. And what do I mean by ballot order? This is another tactic to rig elections. States that have the trifecta, Republicans, Democrats, all three, Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican governor. Florida's had that for way too long. We're going to change that. What they do is they passed a law saying the Republican will appear first on every ballot. And again, that can make, and the judge in this case found that in Florida can make up to a 5% difference in the outcome. And may I remind you, Bush v. Gore, 5% difference is like hundreds of thousands of votes in Florida. Bush v. Gore was 500 votes. So that was 1/100th of 1%. So when you do things like this, these are the types of barriers that you're trying to put in place to make it harder to vote. Signature match, a very relevant conversation item for people in the disability community. Signature match requirements are one of the oldest voter suppression tools in the book. When you couple that, in other words, you signed something a while back when you registered, and then they require you to sign again, and then they have folks who have been at best marginally trained, and they're eyeballing it and saying, nah, it doesn't match, you can't vote, or you got to vote provisional. And then you got to come back and present additional indicia of the fact that you can vote. I mean, how many people sign electronically now? You know, when you go somewhere, you check into a hotel or you're doing something. That bears no resemblance to how my signature might be. But again, I could go through chapter and verse, and so many of these have a disproportionate effect on people with disabilities. And so that's why it is so critically important for us to step up. And what we have done differently in the voter protection context is that we have to recognize that you can't do the sprint. The old model of voter protection was, every election cycle for about 3 months, you open up a pop-up and calling all lawyers, come to us now. That's not what it's about. The key to success here in taking back our democracy is to build a 50-state infrastructure, to organize early, to organize everywhere, to organize together. And when I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about a voter protection infrastructure. We have more voter protection people in place now than ever before, because we know in Arizona what they have done in the past and what they will continue to do. And that's why we're there now. In Kentucky, for instance, last spring, our team didn't have the capacity to do this, frankly, 4 years ago. Our team did a search of their recently refreshed voter file and found that there were 175,000 people that had been purged in the spring of 2019 in the run-up to the election. 175,000 people. and we thought that they were wrongfully purged. And so what do? We worked with the Kentucky Party. We worked with other stakeholders, including groups that had been funded by our friend, Stacey Abrams, Fair Fight. And this is all about the ecosystem, links in a chain. We were the first link in the chain. We uncovered it. We took it to the party took it to lawyers, others in the ecosystem. Lawsuit filed, lawsuit won, 175,000 people restored to the rolls. And when you win by about 5,200 votes, folks, everything you do matters. And now in Wisconsin, one of the advantages we have there, we will be filing lawsuits and have been filing lawsuits. The challenge we have there is we've got a very conservative Supreme Court. So if you just rely on a litigation strategy, that's going to be a challenge. But what we do have going for us is same-day registration. So we can use the April primaries. And the other thing we're doing is they're not even giving us the list of people who've been purged, because they understand that if we get that list, we're going to get them back on the rolls, and we're going to uncover folks who have been wrongfully purged. That's what happened in Ohio. The head of the League of Women Voters in one of the counties was concerned about the Ohio voter purge. And just for kicks, she checked the voter file. They had purged her. Don't purge the head of the local chapter of the League of Women Voters. That is a bad practice when you're trying to suppress the vote. That calls attention to it. I wish these stories were fiction, but they're not. And you can go back to 1985 or 1986 and listen to 41 seconds from a person named Paul Weyrich if you want to know what this is about. Paul Weyrich was one of the godfathers of the modern conservative movement. And Paul Weyrich, I'm trying to multitask here because if I can get this up, I'm going to play it for you. Paul Weyrich said, and I basically quote, "I don't want everyone to vote. Elections are not won and lost by having more people vote. I want less people to vote. And if I can get this on here, I'm going to do it here in a minute." And that will be...
Christians have what I call the goo-goo syndrome. Good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
41 seconds. Paul Weyrich, not in 2016, in 1986. Okay? So if you're wondering what the game plan is of the other side, there's no subtlety to it. And that's what they're doing in Wisconsin. That's what they're doing to African American voters, Latino voters, voters with disabilities, Native American voters in North Dakota in the 2018 election, and in South Dakota when we were making progress re-electing Heidi Heitkamp. They made them go back and get new IDs. I mean, that's what's happening everywhere. And that's why we need everyone to step up. And the good news is people have stepped up. You look at 2017, 2018, 2019. 2014 was the lowest voter turnout since 1942. And 2018 was the highest midterm turnout since the civil rights era. Our democracy has awakened. It has taken a certain person and a certain moment to awaken it, but it has awakened. But we have to stay woke. We must continue this journey. And this is not the first time we've been off the rails, folks. You know, that's why I come to you with optimism. You look at our history, and we had to fight a civil war to correct an original sin, and we still haven't quite gotten there in correcting that original sin. You look at the Know Nothing movement of the mid-19th century, fundamentally anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. You look at what happened to Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants at the end of the 19th century, led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. You look at what happened in the McCarthy era. You look at what happened in so many other moments. And what all those moments, folks, had in common is they came to an end. They came to an end because of that most important word in a democracy. And it's a word I heard Barack Obama utter when I had the pleasure and privilege of going to Selma to mark the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. And he said the most important word in a democracy is we. And it's we the people that have continued to rise up and say, we are indeed a republic. We are not a monarchy. It was we the people like Tony Coelho and Justin Dart and others who rose up and said, people with disabilities should be treated with dignity. It was people like Cesar Chavez who rose up on behalf of farm workers, MLK and others on behalf of our African American brothers and sisters, and we are rising up so much. We heard last night from a woman who sang an iconic song, I won't be quiet no more. It was the mantra, the movement of the Women's March. And people are being really loud. They're causing what John Lewis calls good trouble. And we've caused some good trouble in 3 elections. But I will be honest with you, while I am proud of what we've accomplished in those 3 elections and the infrastructure we've built, we've got to go 4 for 4 because our democracy demands it. The world is watching. We can withstand 4 years, but I am not sure our democracy can withstand 8. And one of the critical elements of our success will be making sure we reduce and eliminate all of the barriers to participation. And we have seen the barriers that have affected the disability rights community, and we have been working from Jump Street to address those. And I'm here to say thank you. Tony, thank you for your thought leadership. Thank you for, sometimes we have conversations where it's like, get your you-know-what and do you-know-what. And that's what advocates are supposed to do. And we're family. So that's what I expect him to do. And he's never let me down. He's always inspired me. And this is just a where were you moment, folks. This is, as the song in Hamilton says, history has its eyes on us right now. And I want history to note that at Loyola Marymount on Thursday, December the 19th, we had an important moment of conversation about what it really means to be a person in the United States in the year 2020. Who are we? What do we stand for? And what will we fight for? And I hope we will put those Ignatian values at work. Those Ignatian values that embody Matthew 25 that says, when you are hungry, I feed you. When you're naked, I clothe you. When you're the immigrant among you, I welcome you in. When you are in jail, I visit you. I treat you with dignity. That's what it's about, the nature of dignity. And for all too many people with disabilities, dignity remains elusive. And that's not right. And that's why I love my job, because we're trying to change that. And we don't always succeed at the pace that we need to, but we are continuing that fight. So thank you so much for what you're doing here. Thank you for this center, because this center is really a center of gravity in the movement. And it is so important that we continue to underscore that while we have made progress, we've got so much more to do. So thank you, Tony, and thank you, everyone here. Appreciate your time.
Well, now you see why we love our chairman so much. Tom has really brought a great deal of enthusiasm to our party and is doing a great job, and we appreciate it. I want to acknowledge, first off, Tim Snyder, the president of Loyola Marymount. I don't know if Tim is still here, but what he's done at the university is just amazing, exciting. For example, in regards to the Coelho Center, he's said basically, let's tear down all the silos. Let's have all the different schools at Loyola participate and work with the dean of the law school, who is the head of the disability council and that puts all this stuff together. So it's exciting that Tim provides that leadership. And Michael Waterstone, who you heard from, is the dean of the law school. He's done a great job. He has a wonderful reputation all over the world about his position in regards to disability. He's written a lot of articles. He's been involved in the movement. And the great thing about Michael, he got involved not because he has a disability, not because anybody in his family has a disability. He just thinks it's the right thing to do. And so he's been involved for years in providing leadership for those of us with disabilities, and we love him for that. And I want to make sure that, Deb, we want you to know that how much we appreciate your being here today. She was a tremendous Secretary of State, and one of her big causes was making sure those of us with disabilities participate in California elections. I wish you were in every state, in some of the states in particular. And also I want to thank Carol Costello, who moderated the panel. All of you know that she was with CNN, just a very well-known person throughout the country, and now she's here at Loyola and doing some great things here. And so I love her and I appreciate what she's done. And the last person I want to thank is Catherine Perez is the new executive director. New for a year. So we opened up on November 5th of last year, and so she's provided great leadership in that year. She also teaches at the law school. She also is working on her doctorate. She also is involved in so many other things, and it's great to have her leading the center. So thank you, Kat, very much. Thank all of you for coming. I appreciate it very much.